Now we will continue straight ahead with a panel, which is framed somewhat differently than what we're normally used to in the academic environment. So the panelists are not going to have presentations as such, but we are hoping this to be a very lively, interactive discussion among themselves as well as with the audience. So feel free to raise your hand up, to ask a question, give a comment, or say anything you'd like to say. I will take note of your interest, and then I will give you space to speak in between the whole discussion. So just raise your hand, and you will have the opportunity to interact. Also, we will refer to the videos that we've just heard. There is plenty food for thought there. So if something interesting came up that you would also like to refer to or include, please feel free to do so as well. Or if you would like to refer to something and ask the panel members, you can do that as well. So let me introduce you our panel members. First, we have Professor Rosemary Deem. She is from Royal Holloway University of London. She is Vice Principal for Education and Dean of Doctoral School. So Rosemary's main research interests focus on policy, leadership, governance, and management of higher education, the consequences of university league tables, doctoral students, the changing purposes and roles of universities, and public service organizations, leadership and change agency, and equality in educational settings. So her work draws on organizational theory, policy analysis, feminist research, new managerialist theory, and comparative social science. So she's written a lot about new public management, managerialism, governance changes in higher education, and it will be very interesting also to hear her thoughts, how this is all connected to globalization and internationalization. So thank you, Rosemary, for coming, and welcome. Second, we have Dr. Chris Muellerleile. He's a lecturer at Swansea University, and his areas of expertise are financialization, political economy of markets, knowledge and information economies, open access publishing, and Chicago Economic School. So he's an economic geographer. This is what Paul has been referring to, that we have actually an interplay between different disciplines also reflected in the panel. So while on the one hand you heard that Chris has been working on financialization, financial markets and financialization as a process, he's also been tackling academic publishing in higher education and production and dissemination of knowledge as such. So he's also a good connoisseur of higher education as a sector and higher education research. So thank you for coming. Then we have Dr. Pauline Ravinet, Assistant Professor of Political Science at University of Lille, so political scientist. Her areas of expertise are sociology of public action, analysis of public policies, European integration, European policies, sociology of European integration actors, higher education policies, and comparative regionalism. So she has been working a lot on regionalisms, but also the balance between regionalisms, globalization, international, local levels, and the political processes behind it. She's currently working on projects that tackle exactly this, higher education regionalism in Europe and Asia, and comparative approach, which gives interesting comparative perspective. Governing through European projects and emergence of international standards. So we've heard a lot about the information and the need for information for different aspects of globalization, and this is a very important input as well. Welcome, Pauline. And finally, we had Dr. Sam Sellar, reader in education studies from Manchester Metropolitan University, who joined Manchester and came to the UK fairly recently from Australia. So Sam's research focuses on intersections between education policy, governance, and data. He is currently part of an international research team investigating the development of data infrastructure in schools and school systems across the USA, Canada, Australia, and Japan. Again, infrastructure and data and what kind of opportunities these bring, challenges as well. Sam also has a long-standing research interest in the education work of the OECD and particularly PISA. And he has worked closely with teacher associations around the world to develop understanding about the politics of educational accountability and the commercialization of public education through the provision of data-focused products and services. So I've took a bit of time to tell you about our panelists for the precise reason that you can see what their expertise is and what they can bring individually into the discussion. Thank you again all for coming. So how this will work is that I will at the beginning ask one question to each of the panelists, one generic question, but then we will individualize questions for each of them separately, okay? So my first question for you is, what is your understanding of the messages in the videos and what you think about them? What are the key points and how you relate to them from your research and theoretical and conceptual backgrounds? Rosemary, would you like to start?
Well, I suppose my first observation would be from the videos is that clearly globalisation appears to be about men telling us what they can sell us, which is an interesting message, and I'm sure not the one that they thought they were conveying. But in a way that does tell us something quite interesting, because it tells us about gender power relations. It tells us that a lot of people have used the term globalisation, which is one of those very elastic terms like social class that can be used to mean all sorts of different things to different people, to effectively push the message that we have something to sell you. It might be, in the case of QS, league tables. It might be, in the case of some of the others, kind of management consultancy. We're helping you with your strategy. We're helping you to recruit students. I think probably only the European Universities Association, which obviously also is selling something, but I think less overtly. I think Jorgensen is saying something rather more profound about what is actually happening in terms of Europe, what some of the issues are. I think the guy from Cardiff Met is also kind of articulating, some of the things at the beginning of his interview, where he talks about the kind of tensions in the globe, about migration, about populism and so on. But really those are the only two who really touch the politics. The others are much more selling things. But I think that's quite interesting too, because globalisation has become, like lots of things in higher education, something to spin. And I think that's possibly something to hang on to in the discussion as we go through.
Thank you. Pauline, would you like to continue?
Yeah, well, this is really nice to begin a roundtable with watching some videos. This is a very different way to tackle the topic today. My feeling was watching the video that, maybe except for the speaker from Cardiff Met University, it's like the understanding of globalization and higher education is about the same in the different videos, meaning this is about, the role of higher education in the global knowledge economy, or this is about, the building of a global higher education market. But this is very much about market and economy, okay? When we say globalization, this is about market and economy. And, of course, as a political scientist, as a scientist first, I'm missing a bit the reflexive dimension and the question about what is global, okay, and what is globalization. And I'm also a bit missing the political dimension, meaning if something global is happening out there about higher education, is it only about the market? Is it only about the global higher education market? Is it only about the global knowledge economy? So I would say that you have plenty of higher education actors in institutions out there playing at the global level. And this is not only about the global economy. There is also something about world politics and something that is happening. And higher education is definitely a sector that does play a role in world politics today. And when you think about global challenges such as, migration, climate change, terrorism, and all this kind of thing, what is the position? What is the role of higher education as a social and political sector? So I think this is very interesting. So there is this global political challenges dimension, and maybe also the global citizenship that is in the Cardiff video as well. Meaning, what does this mean to be a global citizen? Okay, this is very interesting to think about global rankings and so on, but my question will also be, what does it mean to be a global citizen, and how is, the political identity of students changing in Nigeria, in Indonesia, in France, in England, all this. Yep.
Thank you very much. Very good point. Chris, would you like to continue?
Sure. Well, thanks for the invite, and thanks to Paul as well. It's really nice to be here. Yeah, I have a similar reaction. Although the speakers were different, there was a kind of common theme of, I would almost refer to it as a kind of a globaloni, or maybe even go as far as calling it global shit. Where, yeah, it's just kind of this empty placeholder that's invoked repeatedly, and seemingly the more it's used, somehow it becomes real, the scale of the global. So as a geographer, I'm particularly skeptical of privileging any particular scale, and I'm always kind of wondering how any scale that's invoked is really actually is constituted by many other scales. Obviously the most is local. How is the local constituting these global spaces? But so I mean, I'm just interested in that, and it wasn't completely, especially actually the first fellow, Thomas, did talk about some of the kind of, he called them drawbacks of globalization. He referred to concentration and brain drain as being these drawbacks. But that kind of brings me to my second point. It seems like there's a kind of moral economy to some extent of the global as it's presented, where even though some of the speakers refer to these drawbacks of globalization, they're kind of considered to be what isn't global then. So the global itself is considered to be a sort of moral good. It's almost as if the global is automatically open, transparent, flat, so non-hierarchical. The global is about mobility. The global is about sharing. It's about commons. And the things that are drawbacks from the global are the opposite of that. As opposed to imagining them both constituting each other. They're always together, both the global, the local, the closed, and the open. And so that's, I think, the last thing that I'll just stop for now, is that to me there's a kind of, there's almost a kind of dialectic between the openness and the closedness. And while some of the speakers are thinking about some of the closures that happen as a result of kind of opening up to the global, I'd like to see us talk more about, make those more explicit, those closures.
Thank you. Sam?
I'd also like to add my thanks for the invitation to be part of the conversation. As I watched the videos, I kind of looked across all three to try and identify some kind of common processes, I suppose, and I thought that I could see at least three of those. So the first, which has already been discussed, is of course economic processes. So the linking of the globalisation of higher education to broader economic trends, and the growth of the knowledge economy with all the promises that often come with that I do think we have good reason to be sceptical about. And the discussion of new markets for international students, other financial opportunities for institutions, and of course new opportunities for commercial providers. So I definitely agree with this suggestion that a lot of the talk was about being told what different groups can sell higher education in our current moment. Then related to that, I saw, and perhaps a subset of the economic, a whole lot of processes linked to what we might call standardisation. So, for example, the development of rankings that enable comparisons across contexts, talk about the importance of data for consultants who give advice to institutions now, the development of markets for helping institutions to internationalise, the fact that globalisation and internationalisation has been something that private providers can now sell back to universities. And also talk, I guess, about the negative effects of standardisation or centralisation, particularly the first speaker talking about the concentration of knowledge production in particular parts of the globe. We could think, of course, about the north-south divides in knowledge production and theoretical work and so on. And then finally, I saw a set of cultural processes described as well. So the promotion of international research collaboration, the creation of a global scientific community. I take Chris's point about not having a kind of overly simplistic moral overlay here, but I do see the latter as being important in our kind of post-truth moment with the kind of polarising populist trends. This global scientific conversation I do think is important. And then also talk of the role of higher education in bringing people together, this notion of ethical internationalisation or globalisation, and the attempts to balance market or economic processes with academic and humanitarian ones.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any questions or comments at the moment from the audience? Not yet, okay. So I'd like to start with a focus question for Pauline, actually. So you've mentioned about the specific notion of global citizenship. So what does it actually mean? But you worked also in your research and your writings about this tension between the two dynamics, one being the renewal of regional cooperation in all fields and the other international competition. And also we are witnessing lately the increasing tension between, say, the rise of the nation state or even nationalism, and on the other hand, the globalization, the global expansion of markets. So I'm just wondering, how can you actually talk about global citizenship while the nation state still is quite strong and still ever-changing in its borders, meanings, rationalities even?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm not denying the importance of the nation state. As a political scientist, I need the nation state to have a job. So, so maybe to begin with, the regional dimension, regional cooperation, I think that there is something fascinating in the tension between regional cooperation and globalization. And in higher education, what we observe is two very strong dynamics, and they are interrelated, but they are combining, but they are shocking also in different ways. And so this is because we say, globalization of higher education, this is something we sell. There is some kind of moral superiority of what is global. As well, and so this is about international mobility, this is about international scientific cooperation, this is about ranking, this is about transnational education. Okay, but then if we want seriously to grasp what is globalization, what should we do? And my understanding is that, globalization of higher education, it's like a puzzle. And so our mission is to take one piece of the puzzle and to try to cook this piece, okay? And we do it, each one of us with a different disciplinary background, of course. And so it's like my piece would be trying to understand what is happening at intermediary levels, intermediary spaces between national and institutional level and global level. And my feeling is that a lot is happening at the regional level because you have plenty of regional initiatives burgeoning all over the world in higher education. Of course, there is the very well-known European case with the Bologna process and so on. And I've spent 10 years researching on the Bologna process, so I know a bit about this, but this is not the only case, okay? And then the question is, all this happening at the regional level in higher education, is it something that is regulating, that is accommodating globalization and global markets? Or is it something that is more an expression, a simple expression in a sub-trend of globalization? Mm. And I think this is very ambivalent and that this is both at the same time. There is in regional cooperation, in the building of regional political project of cooperation in higher education, there is an attempt to regulate, but at the same time, there is an attempt also to be stronger in the global competition. Okay, so this is this tension. And to answer about the nation state, maybe I would answer saying that someone is missing here in the panel, and this would be an historian. because I think this is very interesting to think about the history of higher education, or maybe even to the history of university as an institution. Okay, because we all know here that university is a centuries-old institution, and so the university was there much before the state and appeared in a vacuum of political power in Europe in the Middle Ages. And then there was this relationship really strange between the university and the state, okay? That, the university was always struggling for its autonomy vis-à-vis the state, but at the same time, universities did play a very important role in the building and the consolidation of the nation state. And so the question is, are we now entering a new phase? Is there a post-state chapter in the story of the university? And maybe this is something that globalization of higher education is about, is what is going to be the political role of university as an institution in a new era in which, the state is not declining, but is deeply transforming itself and it's becoming something new. So, this is a bit vague, but yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Very good points. Especially the last one, where you're asking if this is now the new era or new phase of universities. You're right. Universities are very resilient for different processes and pressures in history, and they have always managed to adjust. Obviously, if they are still existing. In fact, they are one of the 3 oldest still functioning institutions in the world. But it just made me think when you were talking about also Sam's work and then the role of datafication and the global infrastructure. So how you could argue that this is the materiality of the new phase of the university, isn't it? So what are your thoughts about this?
On the role of
data and the infrastructure for globalization of universities and the role of them.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that the people in the video responses said very little about, I suppose, except to allude to the growth of private providers selling products into higher education. Now, I mean, a lot of those products, or increasingly those products, take the form of software packages, software platforms that are data-driven. And we heard the person from Parthenon talking about the importance of having high quality or rigorous data in order to advise institutions on what they should do. So, I mean, I would increasingly see what I would call data infrastructure, these kinds of platforms, and they range from the kind of IT backbones that universities run on to new kinds of instructional programs, adaptive learning systems and so on, enrolment management systems and so forth. I would see those as really being kind of a core part of the next era of higher education, I suppose. And that comes with potential benefits and risks, I think.
Okay, thank you. Okay. But Chris, you were nodding a lot, so do you have comments or responses?
I'm interested in this kind of this infrastructure as well. In kind of thinking about this panel, I was thinking about the scale at which this infrastructure operates, and thinking about the kind of lack of governance structures at the global scale. That's not to say that there aren't; they do exist, of course, and not all of them are at the global. Many of them are at the regional level. But one of the kind of both political, but more importantly, economic actors at the global scale is, of course, international corporations, and they are able to kind of set up the rules of the game, if you will, kind of change the way the actual global landscape, its structure. They're able to structure it to their own benefit. And so it seems to me that some of, publishers in particular, but lots of these kind of digital capitalist organizations are privatizing the kind of global scale, to the extent it's out there, the kind of global scale infrastructure. And I think we have a tendency to imagine these things as a bit mundane, kind of apolitical, day-to-day, not even really that important for what's really going on in the university, what we really care about as academics, kind of pursuing the truth or doing good research or teaching students. And all of this other stuff is just sort of we can't really deal with it, we're too busy with other things. But sort of behind the scenes, that infrastructure is being privatized. And so I think one of the things we need to do is to kind of what Starr and Bowker refer to as an infrastructural inversion, right? Kind of turn that mundane day-to-day stuff into a point of struggle, and think about how, whether or not we should be privatizing it, and whether or not it's changing the very conditions under which the university can be a political actor in this global landscape.
Mm-hmm. You want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that this sort of development is often hidden and kind of can appear mundane, but I think it's actually where one of the crises for the university lurks, I think, because the interests that a lot of these big international corporations, including the biggest, Croton, Brazilian higher education provider, for example, they're really actively interested in these kinds of, say, adaptive learning programs that can be used to scale up higher education without the cost of teacher salaries or lecturer salaries. Now, I think this raises a question about technological displacement. As you grow higher education through these kinds of modes of technical provision, you actually reduce the need for middle-class people to work in the university at a time when the growth of the university is actually sustaining middle-class employment, as we're starting to see more and more automisation, the technological displacement that goes with that. So there's a tension here between the growth of that infrastructure and the way it's being used to kind of address some of the difficulties for provision as we go forward.
Okay, Rosemary?
I mean, I think that also raises an interesting question about digitisation in general, and plus it also raises all the kind of public-private things which we've already touched on a little bit. But so the question is there going to be a split in kind of higher education provision for the elite, where they will still want the kind of face-to-face interaction and so on that we kind of associate with conventional kind of campus-type higher education, and then everybody else gets the digitised version. But also, if we... I mean, of course, the whole question about automisation of kind of lots of professional jobs is a huge issue. And of course, if instead of having to have a casualised workforce, you just had kind of robots trotting around, supervising your students and kind of giving lectures and marking things, of course, that would mean that they do everything on time, although they might break down, I guess, from time to time. And you say, oh, terribly sorry, and the robots all got to go to the garage today, so there's not going to be any lessons. But it's also thinking about that divide opening up between those things which kind of you can sell to people who perhaps don't have a lot of choices, and those things you can sell to people who do have a lot of choices. And that doesn't mirror totally the public-private split, because that's much more complicated in higher education in different countries, but it's got something to do with that. So I think there's a lot of also debates about kind of, who has access to what kind of private higher education going into the future.
Okay. So, although I don't want to leave this debate now, because I think we tackled very, very interesting issues and the balances between the power relations, the privatization of the infrastructure, what does that mean for the state and other actors, power relations, inequalities, and so on. But Sam, you worked also empirically on access to mobility in Australia, so somewhat it also tackles the structural inequality, so what Rosemary just mentioned, who gets access to what, and how does that matter in the process of globalization?
Yeah, so I started my academic life in a higher education policy research centre focused on equity issues. And so I've looked quite a bit at widening participation agendas and the question of aspiration, but also more recently mobility programs and student global exchange or international experience programs, but from a mobility perspective. So with a colleague at La Trobe University, Andrew Harvey, I did a national study in Australia looking at which students are accessing these global mobility programs, which are increasingly being offered as a kind of value add to the student experience. And what we're seeing is, that these programs themselves are becoming a point of distinction within the university. So students from low socioeconomic status backgrounds tend to access them much less frequently than their colleagues, and they tend to go closer to home to, from Australia, say, to Asian universities, whereas students from more elite backgrounds tend to travel to the US, to the UK, to the elite global universities. And so we're seeing a kind of opening up, I suppose, between the kinds of experience that the same students can get within one institution. And what we're also seeing, I guess, is we have a kind of growth in the number of students participating in higher education. Increasingly, students coming from areas that weren't that didn't strongly participate in higher ed, but those students aren't getting the same kinds of globalisation opportunities once they enter the university that their peers are getting.
Okay. Rosemary?
I was just thinking, I'm in the middle of editing a book from a conference run in Cambridge last September, and one of the chapters I've been reading is by two Norwegian academics, Hornfeldt and Kalm, and what they did is they tracked students who'd been on exchange visits, which I think involve a project or a dissertation. They're undergraduates of different kinds. Some are full-time, some are part-time undergraduates, some are kind of quite young, some are kind of mature students. And they didn't sort of just go off to other European countries. They often went to places like India and Africa and so on. And one of the things that they found is that actually the effect on quite a lot of those students was to induce either a kind of xenophobia about the places they visited, or for people feeling, well, actually, they're so unlike us, I can't relate to it. And very few students actually really felt comfortable in the countries they visited. And they were not short visits. I think they went for something like 2 or 3 months. So we tend to think that, internationalisation and student mobility is, quote, a good thing, but maybe sometimes it has undesirable effects, and we need to think about that as well, because otherwise it becomes like globalisation and those videos, it's a wonderful thing, and, we can sell you this and we can sell you that and we can help you. And I think it's really important that we think about both sides of that spectrum.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just maybe to jump on what was just said, I think that in what you said about this study on equity in mobility programs and so on, what is very interesting is to go beyond the idea that the globalization would be neutral, okay? Because it's like everyone is struggling to go more global, because this would be good to go more global. But I mean, globalization, basically, a basic definition that we could agree on would be about more circulation. Okay, any kind, people, knowledge, goods, whatever. Okay, but then if we talk about globalization of higher education, what is it for? This is a question, okay? And it could be for many different things. And this is definitely what was missing in the videos that we've seen. Okay, is it for markets? Is it for equity? Is it for freedom? There was the word freedom, and I mean academic freedom. This is something quite important in higher education. This was not mentioned in the videos, and this is very important. Yeah.
Okay, I will just give you a floor in a second, but just to respond very quickly. It's a very interesting point, what is globalization for? And it seems to me that it can be many different things from very different actors. And this is, again, depending on what the aim is, but also what kind of power position do they have in the very uneven world. But a very good point. So, one of the initial questions I had for the panel is, what are we actually talking about here? Are we talking about global markets? Are we talking about cultural exchange and a beneficial impact of interacting with other cultures? And I'm not really sure that it's possible to distinguish or separate these different dimensions. So it seems to me that there is a big, complex, uneven ensemble, really, for different actors at different places. But Sam, you wanted to respond to Pauline. Sorry to jump into that.
No. I mean, I think with regard to mobility, the talk is often about cultural exchange and the benefits to the student of working, studying, living in another place. But I think often it's just as much about credential inflation, and globalisation is a kind of a new edge of credential inflation where you can obtain the same degree as your peers in an institution, yet have something above and beyond what they might get from that degree. I've always kind of kept with me a quote from a report, and I can't remember the exact details of the report off the top of my head, but looking at student mobility in the UK, and there was a student who talked about The fact that they'd always anticipated studying at Cambridge, this was the plan. But quite recently they'd decided to go and study somewhere on the east coast of the US at an Ivy League university, simply because all their peers were going to Cambridge, and they would come back with something that their peers didn't have. And I thought that kind of made the point quite well.
Yep. So if we move slightly, it seems to me that we will stay with this different relational and power relations sphere, but when it comes, Chris, to you and your work on academic publishing, we can also notice very rich and complex dynamic going on there, involving privatization, globalization, power relations, new modes of knowledge production, dissemination, really. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, just kind of listening to the other panel members here and thinking about mobility, I guess I was thinking about the mobility of knowledge. And increasingly there's a kind of, I'm going to go back to this kind of idea of a moral economy. There's a moral economy of openness when it comes to the movement of knowledge. Knowledge is supposed to now, we're told, not have any boundaries that block it from moving across space, whether it's between bodies, between countries, between publishers, universities, whatever it might be. And so the kind of biggest critique of conventional publishing is that academic work is behind a paywall, right? Which is no longer necessary in a world of digital flows of information. And so this has become something that's wrong and bad, and there's a lot of good reasons why it is a serious problem. Namely that it just becomes too expensive for everyone to buy access to the knowledge that academics have produced, right? We all know this story. But I think what's happening as a result of this kind of moral economy of openness, this idea that there cannot be any blockages to the movement of knowledge, is it's putting a lot of pressure on what Michael Baskar refers to as curation practices, the way that knowledge is produced, filtered, edited, and probably the best example of that is there's a lot of pressure on peer review. So if you talk to open access advocates, most of them will say there is no necessary change to peer review by moving to an open access model. And I would say that that is true. There isn't a necessary change, but in effect what's happening is that peer review is beginning to disintegrate. I was just looking at this thing called the Altmetrics Manifesto this morning. Altmetrics are these kind of different ways of basically doing kind of citation analysis without doing citation analysis. So tracking likes and tweets and things like that related to research, and then kind of judging the impact of the research based on those. Anyway, the first thing in this Altmetrics Manifesto was that peer review is out of date. We got to get rid of it. There's an idea that peer review is, it's flawed, and there are flaws, of course, with it. That it's opaque, that it's hierarchical, and ultimately that it's corrupt. And that we should get rid of peer review and move to a crowdsourcing model of kind of filtering knowledge. So publish everything, and the best knowledge will kind of filter up to the top through, different digital search engines and all kinds of different things like that. So that's the kind of background. I think what's happening as a result, and it's not just a result, but it's a big dynamic going on. But you have this kind of now world of open knowledge, and the publishers, the big for-profit publishers, and we shouldn't categorize all publishers together. There's lots of different kinds, and especially these days, the whole idea of publishing is changing. But big for-profit publishers are finding ways to take what we might consider the waste almost, and I mean waste in the sense of the global commons, in the sense of the way we thought of the way common land was referred to in Britain prior to the enclosures. It was referred to as the waste because it wasn't meaningfully enclosed, didn't have value, in other words. The publishers are finding ways to create value around openness. In other words, they're enclosing the openness. They're just doing it through the back door, through things like altmetrics, through things like all of these different kind of data infrastructure that are emerging, current information research systems, CRIS systems that publishers sell to universities to make sense of this massive world openness. And I'll stop in a second now because I've talked too long, but it does remind me of, in the video, you got a number of people saying, for instance, the third and fourth speakers said the exact same phrase, make the right decisions. So, I mean, you just have this kind of, and I'm changing content here, but I mean, this global world, it's very difficult. There's so much information. There's so many markets. There's so many actors. You need help to make the right decisions. Publishers are saying, we can help you make the right decisions of what to read, of what to cite, of what is the best research.
Okay, thank you. So what stayed with me is the phrase "world of open knowledge" that you used. So Rosemary, could you comment on this and how it relates with the knowledge workers' governance of universities?
I mean, I think clearly this question about what counts as open knowledge is a kind of issue for all universities, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I mean, if you go back to Jorgensen talking about, well, we want everything to be open, but actually, as people have said, a lot of these things are not open at all. And I think the peer review question is interesting because it doesn't just relate to publications, it relates to just about everything we do. So it relates to grants, it relates to kind of people's promotions, it relates to people getting kind of jobs in the first place. So this whole question of, how could you come up with a better system? Because clearly it is flawed. As a journal editor, I'm only too well aware of that because, I was thinking when I was first a journal editor on a sociology journal in the kind of late 1990s, early 2000s, that actually you probably had to get about 6 referees in order to get 2. Now I often have to get 12 or 14 in order to get 2, and that just gets more and more difficult to do it. And the question is that sustainable? But also, what else is happening in the kind of world of kind of publishers and digitisation? I mean, it's interesting that Elsevier, who I think are extremely problematic, are buying up everything. So they bought a system called Pure, which many European universities use to manage their research data. They're buying up kind of things. I think Academia Edu is also owned by Elsevier now. And Elsevier are also having these quite sharp discussions in different countries to try and raise the price of all their journals way above the rate of inflation in any country at all. There's a lot of very problematic things going on there, which is very difficult to see how individual universities can act because you have to act collectively. So when all these kind of people on the video say, we're helping you to make decisions, but they're helping individual institutions to make decisions, but it isn't individual institutions that are going to stop Elsevier. I mean, there has been a fight back in a couple of countries about it. I think in the UK, in the end, they came up with a slightly better settlement, but it wasn't that good. It seems to me that there is a kind of need for a kind of collectivisation and collaboration to fight back, to really say, what the hell is open knowledge? Because at the moment, what's happening is the public purse is paying for a lot of that knowledge. You then charge universities to get it back. Now, that's been going on for a long time. But now, as you pointed out, there's an awful lot of institutions and organisations out there taking it back twice or even 3 times. And so it's not only that they're selling the knowledge back, but they're selling all these things to manage the knowledge. And I think that's a really big issue for universities. And I don't see that much sign that people have really understood that. So there's always that tension between individual institutions and their desires and ambitions and how they can actually act collectively to stop some of those things. Because unless they do, then I think it's going to become a major problem, actually. And soon even students won't be able to access some of this stuff. Because increasingly journals are sold in bundles. If you want such and such a journal, you have to buy a load of journals you might not want very often, which is just like, buy one, get one free in the supermarkets, isn't it? I mean, they don't call it that, but that's what it is. And that's a huge problem, I think, for globalised universities.
But does this relate to what Chris talked about before, the enclosure, so making value, but that means economic value out of something. So it seems to me that it's a lot about enclosing, privatizing, creating markets out of what is open, isn't it?
Well, it's a struggle. I mean, it's a struggle over a global knowledge commons and a kind of, different kind of segments of closed off pockets of knowledge. I think, I agree with almost everything you said. One of the things that I didn't mention was that, I think there's an unevenness when we talk about who has access, for instance, mobility, who has access to particular kinds of knowledge, who has access to different knowledge production practices. And I think as peer review becomes under more and more pressure, or the entire model of kind of curating knowledge prior to publication, what happens is that, and this is a speculation on my part, but the people who can least afford to abandon that help in curating knowledge prior to publication are the ones who need it most. Graduate students or postgraduate students, early career scholars. And so there's a lot of good things about open access, but I think one of the bad things is imagining that somehow knowledge is just either discovered and then exists, or is just sort of codified by a mind on, in a text and then becomes knowledge. It doesn't really work like that. Knowledge is embedded in communities. Knowledge is created collectively. Editors serve, well, people get really annoyed with editors sometimes, but they also can do really good work. Peer reviewers can do really good work and really bad work. But it can make your knowledge much, much better and in conversation with other knowledges and communities and things like that.
Okay. Yes, Ali?
Hello, my name is Ali from University of Bristol. My question is going to Sam. You mentioned standardization, globalization and standardization. Actually, within universities and beyond maybe universities, diversification, diversity, or polarization, this kind of thing is really important ethos as far as I understand. But it sounds a little bit like contradictory, like to standardization, the process. So I wonder what you think, like in the university level side, the standardization and kind of like respecting diversity going along. And then linking to this question, I would like to ask a question about what do you think about the localization, deglobalization, anti-globalization as a kind of, how do I say, try to be against the globalization, the drawbacks of globalization. So, thank you.
Okay. Your question brings to mind a line from Gayatri Spivak. She said that globalisation only takes place in capital and data, and it's not something that just happens at the level of our experience. And so I think that's how I would interpret your question. I think the standardisation that I'm talking about relates to markets and the kind of economic processes that we've been talking about, and also to the technical and infrastructural level. Whereas diversification, I guess the different experiences that higher education makes possible for staff and students happens at the level of human experience as well, and we need to treat those things differently but understand the relation between the two of them. I would say that the kinds of technical and economic standardisation processes that are occurring at the moment, I think the notion of resistance is a complicated one because I'm not quite sure what the political subject would be that would resist those. I think academics haven't been particularly good at resisting the kinds of pressures to performativity, the kind of measurement and evaluation of their work that's clearly problematic, and we all know that, but it goes on. We get evaluated using bibliometrics, student surveys. We know the data's problematic. We know it can't support the claims that are made on that basis, but there hasn't been this kind of collective response. So how we would manufacture that collective in this moment in order to kind of pursue the kinds of deglobalisation or anti-globalisation that you were referring to, I'm not sure. I think it's an important question, but I'm not sure how we would answer it.
Okay, thank you. Also, in the introductory speech by our Vice-Chancellor, he mentioned there this balance between the local university and the global institution. I found that very interesting, and also talking about the globally significant versus globally leading as the institution. So, talking about the world as flat, as in open, global, equal for everybody, but then on the other hand, economic interest and standardization and building of the global infrastructure, and what Pauline said before about the roles of university and also their roles as social institutions in relation to the state. So I know I'm now putting a lot on your plate, Pauline, but I'm having a hard time a bit of specifying the exact question, but really how does the political processes and multi-scalar governance at the state regional level then talk to each other in this sense, while there is a lack of the global governance structures as such. Can we have the flat world of open knowledge in this very complex political governance?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, maybe I'm going to be a bit messy. So first, because higher education is a sector in which we don't have any international organization for the governance of the sector, this is really one of the reasons why we do need to look at the regional level. Okay, if we want to understand what is happening beyond the state or above the state, well, if we want to grasp something, I think this, well, we don't have a real higher education international regime as we would have for health or for environment, for instance. Okay, so, but it's not completely free and marketized, okay? We do have political agreements and cooperation, okay? But a lot is happening at the same time, and a lot of this is very ambivalent, okay? Well, so this is one first point. The second point, and maybe this is coming from the fact that I'm a French speaker, okay? And so because our understanding of the word global in French is there is a tension between, well, the English understanding, meaning world, global as world, okay? So globalization is, we say in French, mondialisation. We have globalisation and mondialisation as well, meaning more circulation and blurring of boundaries in the world, okay? But global also means, well, like the analytical sense in English, overall or comprehensive, okay? So when you think about something as global, this is very interesting to combine both meanings, okay? Meaning that, well, you have something about levels of governance and scales and the blurring of the vertical dimension. But when you're trying to understand the global dimension of something, this is also about what is comprehensive, holistic in our understanding of a social object. Okay? And to me, this is what is very interesting, because the state is in the center of this combination. The state is trying to position in the multi-level, multi-scale dynamics, globalization as mondialisation, okay? But the state, because there is no one else to do this, the state is also in charge of expressing the holistic view of policy sectors, okay? Because who else would do this, okay? There is no one else on the world scene to do so. And so maybe the globalization of higher education, this is this tension, okay, between international and transnational dynamics and global competition, and where is the state in this? And this is also about how to express and formulate something about a transversal and deep transformation of the sector. But maybe this is very abstract. I don't know.
Thank you. Rosemary?
I mean, I was trying to think of a slightly different interpretation of kind of local and global, because I was thinking about, yes, I know but the kind of Brexit debate post the referendum was that universities got heavily criticised in the UK because it said, oh, it's all the university's fault, all these privileged people with degrees, they all voted to remain, but, people who haven't got degrees all voted to leave. It isn't quite as clear-cut as that. But there's some sort of sense that, universities were neglecting their kind of local and regional role in favour of their kind of, much more global role. But so that's the argument. Oh, it's university's fault somehow. We failed. But actually, you could argue that actually what they did was succeed, because universities were probably one of the few organisations in the UK where people of all different generations voted to remain, and that's quite interesting. So that might be an achievement, and nobody's ever talked. I mean, I talked about that when I talked to the Parliamentary Select Committee in January in Oxford. But they said, oh, nobody's made that point before. But I think it's that sort of sense of how do you balance the kind of local, the regional, and the kind of international, because they are quite difficult things to do. And yes, people have written about kind of universities trying to be both kind of local and regional and national and international, but it's quite hard for institutions to do that. And then to kind of get criticised because you've missed out one little bit of it, or it's assumed that you've missed out one bit of it, I think is kind of an interesting comment, but it doesn't necessarily help universities very much to think through that complex relationship of those things. And that's the kind of thing that one would hope that in the days when kind of senates were really democratic bodies, that they might have debated. But I can't imagine a senate in a UK university now having that kind of debate, because they'd be terrified, and the vice-chancellor would be terrified they might lose their knighthood chance, or, you know, their salary would go down because, you know, people would find that people were criticising things that they did. And I think it's finding a space to have those debates that it has become more difficult, I think. And that's something I think we ought to be really concerned about. And clearly that's not just something that's happening in the UK. I think that's happening everywhere. It's that whole sort of spread of boardism and managerialism and neoliberalism and all of those things that have actually challenged the kind of spaces we still have for open debate in universities. I know there's a whole other debate about, you know, no platforming and so on, but and that's also relevant to this, but obviously that goes off in a different direction.
Okay. In this sense, what seems to me also interesting is, Sam, you were working on analyzing and looking at building global infrastructures for schools and how different countries actually participated. So it seems to me that there were committees and structures set up that involve different states, government representatives, as well as private sector. So the private sector seems to be investing a lot in sort of participating or setting up different structures and governance structures as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the extent to which the private sector can shape the standardisation process and the kind of the standardisation of curriculum, of assessment, they expand the markets to which they can sell their products. Yeah. So there's obviously a big stake for private providers to actually set the agenda around the development of these kinds of technological infrastructures.
Okay. So I'm going to ask a very hard question now. I'm going to ask Chris, because we've been discussing when preparing for this panel, and I said I will ask him, how can economic geography inform higher education research, theoretically and methodologically, which is a question that could be answered for hours. But it seems to me now is the right point to ask you this.
Let's see. I'll conveniently avoid answering your question a little bit. Let me try. I was reminded one of the speakers. I think it was the. I'm just looking here if I can find it. Parthenon, I think, referred to. I don't know if it was research or I think it was research as a capital intensive business.
Higher education.
Yeah, higher education. I mean, I kind of just wrote down, is it really? I mean, or does it really have to be? I mean, clearly kind of like STEM disciplines increasingly seem to be capital intensive, but I would say many of the other disciplines really don't need to be capital intensive. But, okay, nevertheless, if they are, and just kind of thinking about globalization, it seems to me like one of the questions we're asking is, or one of the things we're saying is, we want some things to be global and we want other things to not be global. We want a global knowledge commons, but we don't really want international flows of speculative, debt markets on, student debt and things like that. But if we're going to continue down the path of making higher education and academic research capital intensive, I think we're going to be stuck to some extent with capital, and now I'll kind of try to get to your question a little bit, capital searching for a spatial fix. So in the wake of kind of the crisis of Atlantic Fordism, or whatever you want to call the economic crises of the 1970s, and the kind of emergence of a global economy, capital is kind of searching for a new spatial fix where it can kind of attach itself to continue to accumulate profit, accumulate surplus value. And I think that it's in some ways has been relatively successful of creating this global spatial fix. Not in all ways, of course. In 2008, we saw a deep crisis of that attempt to kind of globalize speculative flows of debt. But I think we have to take that seriously. And I mean, this is one of the things that some economic geographers think about. Bob Jessup spends a fair amount of time writing about the spatial fix or spatial temporal fixes here at Lancaster. So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't think it does really, but
somewhat. Because as said at the beginning, one of the aims of this seminar and today is also to think from the perspective of different disciplines about globalization and higher education. So I would like to continue with Pauline in this sense. If you could also comment, how do you see, how could political science, how does it contribute to research in higher education? And also if you could comment a bit on Chris's answer about capital looking for spatial fix. How would you comment on this from political science perspective?
Okay.
So 2 questions really.
Well, power and capital, like the basic questions for all of us. Okay. So first about the contribution of political science and international relation to higher education research. So one of the main development in IR is about saying, okay, international relations today are not anymore only interstate relations. Okay, world politics, global politics, it's a lot also about the participation of non-state actors on the global scene. Okay, and so definitely higher education actors and institutions are important. Okay, well, the firms selling international university rankings, for instance, well, they are global players, okay? Nobel Prizes in the way they stand up in debate on important global issues, for instance, they are international players, and this is very interesting. This is a first point. Then something else that is very interesting and that political science can bring to the debate is about the definition of the mission of a sector. Okay, this is a much more public policy-oriented perspective because there is the way the actors and the institutions within the sector are defining themselves and their missions. Okay, but even if we have a sort of transformation and a sort of partial decline of the state, what is still the role of the state is to define the role of different sectors. And to me, what is very interesting is the way that higher education in the discourse in the last 20 years has always been presented as a problem solver sector. Okay, and this is true about Europe, but this is, for instance, this would be something common between Europe and Southeast Asia. In 2 completely different political environments and 2 different contexts economically, the notion that higher education is a key sector because this is a problem solver sector. This is some higher education and research, of course. This is very interesting. And so this would be a very important agenda, I would say, for a political science, public policy agenda, would be to try to disentangle all this notion, how and why higher education is constructed as a problem solver sector. Okay, and what are the implications of this in terms of public policy reforms? Because sometimes this would mean giving more autonomy to institutions, sometimes this would mean give more space for the market, and sometimes it would mean, on the contrary, regulate more. So these are two directions I see for political science research on global higher education, but maybe more will, but I mean, for me the basic question is that, well, globalization is deeply transforming the state as an institution, and states are also deeply involved in globalization. And so higher education is a case of this, but higher education is also a player in this. So this is very interesting.
Thank you. Rosemary, if we can continue with you. It's a very interesting point that Pauline just raised, how higher education is framed as the problem solver. I think this also speaks to your work.
Yeah, I mean, so far as sociology is concerned, I guess what the kind of lens it turns on higher education is around, obviously, kind of social relationships. It's about kind of how those got constructed. It's about how inequality is kind of still transmitted by institutions which claim that they're doing the opposite. So, elite universities often claim that they're kind of trying to admit, working class students and students from disadvantaged backgrounds by offering them a slightly lower kind of qualification level that they have to get in with. But then when they get there, they treat them as though they're exactly the same as everybody else, which means, of course, that they often end up not passing. And so I think, and that's clearly not just a kind of national issue, it's also an international issue. We touched a bit on how credentialism's changing in various ways. So if you have international mobility, your CV looks better than someone who doesn't. But we know that if you're from a disadvantaged background, the chance of you getting that kind of CV is very low. So that there's a lot of kind of issues around kind of how different kinds of credentialism are presented, I think, and how that is worked through both the kind of individual institutions, how those institutions relate to national systems, how the national systems relate to transnational systems in terms of things like Bologna, because a lot of those things don't really touch on inequality. There's a lot of discussion about diversity and what that means, but actually the structures of inequality are still quite embedded both in kind of national systems and local institutions. So people say, well, it's a wonderful success in many countries in the world, over 50% of all undergraduates are women. But if you look at the disciplines they're in, they're not necessarily the disciplines that lead to a well-paid job. And also, women are still massively, in just about every country in the world, discriminated against in terms of equal pay. So estimates about, it might take 100 years in many countries for women to get equal pay. So clearly, some of the things that we think we might have solved, we haven't solved at all. And I think that's one of the big contributions it makes. But it's also to look at kind of power hierarchies, again, within systems, within individual universities. The whole debate about new managerialism and about new forms of governance is about, who gets to occupy the powerful positions and how do they get there and what are they sustained by. And again, that's not really changing that much. Who they are is changing, but in terms of inequality, that's not changing very much at all. So I think those are two quite powerful things.
Sam, it seems to me that you are also approaching your research from an interdisciplinary angle, aren't you? Combining different conceptual frameworks. Could you maybe explain us what you're combining in your work?
Yeah, so I come from a sociology background, but I found work in sociology and anthropology looking at aspiration and affect and emotion really useful to think about the way in which in higher education aspiration as part of this effort to bring new groups into the university has become a target of policy. I think it's interesting to think about that, and I'm kind of thinking about Rosemary's comments and Chris's, to think about that in relation to bring two things together, I suppose, the effort to widen participation in higher education, but also the role that higher education plays in the global economy. And I find Randall Collins' claim that higher education's become kind of hidden Keynesianism now. It's a way for the state to kind of prop up capital. He argues it's the last escape valve for the looming capital crisis, is just to kind of plough people that don't have jobs back into higher education. I think thinking that in relation to equity agendas, which of course play into the kind of promises of the knowledge economy, but also serve this function of bringing people into education and keeping them there longer as the labour market changes. I think that's one kind of set of issues that the different frameworks that I bring to bear helps me to attend to.
Okay, thank you.
I could say one more thing, which is to keep thinking about this idea of HE as a problem-solving sector. It seems like with digital technologies, at least to me, you've entered this kind of this stage of hyper innovation, where digital technologies are kind of just increasingly changing faster and faster and faster. But there's technology transfer is also happening at faster and faster rates. So technology moves across nation-state borders. And so to get back to the kind of economic geography question, a lot of times economic geographers are thinking about how actors at particular geographic scales or at institutional scales are trying to capture the benefits of higher education or capture the benefits of academic research. So whether it's at the urban scale or just the university scale, the urban scale, the nation-state scale. And so as technology transfer continues to move, as information knowledge moves across the world faster and faster, the kind of developed world needs to continue to change at an even more rapid pace to kind of stay at the top of the value chain. And I think one of the speakers on the video mentioned this exact thing. You've got to continue to innovate, but you've got to innovate. You've got to accelerate the pace of your innovation to stay ahead, to stay at the top of the value chain, to capture the most value-added or kind of knowledge-added parts of the production process. Stop there. But I maybe I won't stop there, because I think that actually this helps us understand to some extent why the inequality never goes away. Because the developed world just continues to change at a faster pace. And whether or not there's some limits to this level of innovation is another question. But
Okay. Questions, comments? Yes, please.
Can I ask a question, general question which arises from this discussion and from what was said earlier, and that is, are we tying ourselves in knots by treating higher education as a single entity? We use the word diversity a lot, but we still think of higher education as being something which we can identify. And we think of universities as being synonymous with higher education. But at the very least, there are two separate issues there. There are institutions called universities which do things, and there is an activity which was concerned with, let's call it knowledge, and that subject was raised. And or both of those are extremely diverse. And one question is everything that a university, a modern university does, legitimately called higher education? And my second question is knowledge actually, can we make statements about knowledge and open knowledge which are equally true for nuclear physics and for sociology and for law and for accountancy? This is more a research question than a general question in higher education. But do we do ourselves harm by thinking of higher education as an activity which has got to encompass an enormous range, a huge range of activities, and try to treat them all under one umbrella? Some things definitely are local. I mean, I suppose the North Korean nuclear physicist uses the same equations as the North American nuclear physicist. But I'm not sure that the legal system they have to study is exactly the same as our legal system. And do we not have to take account of these kinds of differences when we're talking about diversity, internationalisation, globalisation, and so on?
Yes, thank you very much. A very good question. Yes, Rosemary?
I think we do talk about it. I think the problem is that when you're doing something like this panel, you can't constantly kind of specify every kind of dimension of difference and variation. I mean, clearly there's a huge debate about isomorphism, which I guess partly goes along with the kind of organisational stuff about, global policies and global ideas make everywhere the same, which I'm never agree with anyway, because I think every time you visit a different kind of version of higher education, whether it's kind of in a particular place or whether it's a kind of virtual system, you find differences. But I think people do think of it like that. But if you're trying to generalise sometimes, then to save time, you can't possibly go through all those. I think people are extremely well aware of those. The question about how you deal with it, I think, is quite different. because it's hard to know how individual institutions can actually handle all those complexities. But I think that, of course, there are things that higher education does which are not higher education. So, for example, in England, in the UK, universities are being asked to run schools at the same time as they're being told that their teacher training is complete rubbish, which is quite interesting because it's completely contradictory. But so obviously running a school isn't higher education. Now, the argument would be it's about raising aspirations, but then a lot of the work on widening participation says, no, many people from disadvantaged backgrounds have higher aspirations already, but that in itself is not enough. So I think it's quite a complicated thing to think about conceptually, about how we constantly refer to that. But I think people are very aware of all those differences. Now, whether when you talk to those people who are trying to sell something to higher education, of course, they're aware of it too, because one of the things that a lot of those organisations do is they look at the league tables. So if you talk to even something like Future Learn, which is kind of the thing that came out of the Open University in the UK and develops MOOCs and so on, you know, one of the things that they're very fussy about is what kind of university they will take into Future Learn. Now, to me, that's problematic, because what you ought to be interested in is institutions that are trying to innovate in terms of kind of how you spread the notion of how you can offer knowledge, who gets access to it, what they do with it. But that's very common, that, you know, there are organisations out there which are transnational or national, where they only want certain people in it. And that's where some of that comes from, I think. So, yeah, I think there are lots of things probably that higher education does which are no longer really counted as higher education. But in a sense, that's probably true of an awful lot of other organisations. If you look at how many organisations that started off doing things like, you know, road engineering and got into management consultancy, you can see there's exactly the same kind of thing taking place there.
Okay. Anybody else like to answer?
In relation to the second part of your question, I do think it is interesting with the growing requirement to enter research data into open repositories, the way that feeds back onto how we think about the kinds of data that we collect. And I think that varies across disciplines. So I think for some disciplines, the data that you collect and put in those repositories, it's less of an issue. Whereas for social science, for example, and certain variants of that, it's very difficult to imagine how you would enter the required metadata so that someone in North Korea could make sense of your interview data. And then that starts to shape your thinking about, well, what kind of data might I collect that could be, you know, more open. And I think that's an interesting dynamic at play now.
Mm. Thank you. Pauline?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. I think you're perfectly right to emphasize that we were discussing the globalization part of the topic of the seminar, but not maybe the higher education part as such. We were not questioning the higher education category. So I think this is very interesting question. Because it's like university, it's a very specific institution, okay? And then we have higher education as a social sector, as a segment of society, okay? So research would be in charge of producing knowledge, and higher education would be in charge of applying and transmitting knowledge. And by this way, also transforming knowledge, maybe. Okay. In university, it's a bit different. It's a social and political institution defined by different criteria that we know, okay, which are a combination between higher education, between teaching and research, institutional autonomy and academic freedom, okay? But not all higher learning enterprise is university, okay? This is true. And so what is the definition for organization and player in the sector of higher learning which are not universities? This is a very important question, especially when we address globalization. And so is the university institution, is it the driver of the higher education sector? Because this is so specific, because this is a so-called pivotal institution of the post-industrial society, because this is where research and higher education are combined, the university. So this is a very specific institution, but is it like the driver of the whole sector, or is it just like one institution among others within the higher education sector? And how is globalization changing this balance between universities and other higher education organizations and actors? This is a very, very interesting question, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I could say something briefly about,
Okay.
again, about open knowledge and across disciplines. And yes, I think we should be thinking about it differently. There's a lot of times a kind of moral argument is made in disciplines like medicine that speed is really important, and that we need to get research out to the public or to other researchers as fast as possible because it can save lives. But in other disciplines, I think there's important questions about slowing things down, whether or not we should take more time to think harder about our ideas, to write very carefully, very thoughtfully. And so, the question I would ask, or one question I would ask is, what's wrong with charging a very modest subscription to a journal? I'm not talking about Elsevier's, £5,000 a year, but if you could manage a journal for £100 a year or £50 a year, is there something kind of fundamentally wrong with charging a small fee to pay for what is a kind of an expensive process, unless you're going to do all the labor yourself as an academic? And it is a lot of work to manage a journal. So how have we reached this point where that is kind of morally wrong to even imagine that possibility? And I think one of the reasons is that there's a lot of different things going on with the way that knowledge is being produced, and there's machine learning. There's ideas, again, to go back to that altmetrics manifesto that I mentioned. One of the things it says is, human beings just cannot comprehend the amount of data, information, academic research that is out there in the world. You have to have machines help you to create new knowledges. Is this true across all disciplines? I'm not so sure. Is it necessary across all disciplines? I think probably not, but...
Okay, thank you. We have a question way at the back.
Yeah, Christopher May, Lancaster University. I spent a lot of time thinking about open publishing and open access many years ago, and I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a sense that it is sensible to have some sort of subscription, and the reason for that is you ask, what does the academy get out of journal subscriptions? And the answer is, of course, we're subcontracting out trust and authority, because we don't trust ourselves to judge whether things are being published or not, or to have that sort of fair process. So when peer review works, when it's not corrupt, and I don't think it is that corrupt, I think there's a lot of sort of noise around that, you do end up getting journals that are reasonable. But I just want to come back to Sam's point. You've raised the sort of general point, what can we ask from other disciplines about this sort of issue? And of course the key question, if we want to change academic sort of community mores, is to ask a question about collective action. And the question I posed, I think, 10 years ago in the article I wrote about open access to publishing in political science was, why isn't political science adopting open access? To which the answer is, well, people don't submit journals to open access publishers, and secondly, they don't cite those articles. They cite them from the normal inverted commas journals. So in some areas, and this goes back to Jana's question about difference between disciplines, some areas, for instance, in computing and sort of information science, you've got a journal like First Monday that's been running for 20 years, completely open access, very well regarded, highly cited in the disciplines that it's relevant to, and runs on a relatively cheap budget out of Erasmus University in Maastricht. So there is a model there. Public Library of Science has been going for many, many years, because there is a notion within the sort of, if you wish, the hard sciences, that there is a sort of collective activity around knowledge production. I think part of the problem for many of the social sciences and humanities, and this sort of goes back to questions about political power and how the globalisation of higher education plays out, there's a massive individualisation of research, which means that people don't think, or many researchers don't think about what are the overall implications of their actions. They don't think, okay, well, why am I citing particular things in particular journals? Why do I value those? Rather, it's treated as if it's just natural. But equally, and I think this is very interesting, the question about Elsevier and academia edu, there was a big sort of to-do-ment on academia edu about 3 months ago, when it became clear that academia edu is finally having to monetize their model. There's a shift to, there's a sort of a prime level and a sort of basic level. A lot of people are complaining about these extra things they're getting. But at some point, the people who work for academia edu have to be paid. It's no different to any other area. And so the question is, the same way that we all have jobs and therefore the money has to come from somewhere, at some point, anywhere in higher education, one has to think, how does one generate an income to pay the people who are working in it? And I think there's sometimes an extraordinary naivety in the academic community about how that plays out. Now, that's not to say I'm arguing for a full-scale commercialisation of higher education, but I think we do need to recognise where we value services as a community, how we can contribute to those services with our time, and if we don't want to contribute them with our time, how much we're willing to pay. It comes back to your suggestion about how much would we value a particular model of journal. So I think there is definitely an opportunity to reorganise how we do those things, but it comes back to Sam's question. It's an issue of collective action, and how do we organise that? And what we draw from other disciplines is trying to figure out why that collective action isn't happening. So, it's the classic thing, Alan Ostrom's issues around the commons, how we understand the sorts of regulatory activities that are not property-led that might lead to that sort of collective action.
Okay, thank you. Sam?
I agree, and just a couple of points in response. I think, of course, the big international publishing houses have an incredibly clever model where they basically they have the esteem journals where we have to publish. They generate the esteem indicators that get used to measure our output, and they run on free labour quite often too. And that's something that's not talked about as much, but the amount of time that's spent doing editorial work that is effectively just outsourced labour from these publishing houses. I think talking about that more is part of building the kind of conditions for a collective response in disciplines where there hasn't been one to date.
Yeah, I would just more add something than respond, because I think I would agree with most of what you said. There's an assumption, I think, in the OA discourse often that academics have no right to be remunerated for their labor in producing knowledge. The argument that's made is that academics are paid by universities, and this is part of what they're paid to do. But really, that only applies to kind of full-time, permanent position academics. And increasingly, we know that academic labor is, kind of becoming part of this kind of precariat, or whatever you want to call it. So when it comes to postgraduate students, early career researchers, people who are not on permanent contracts, why do we assume that they should not be paid? Now, of course, there's something else going on as well. They're being paid, if you will, kind of symbolically through the prestige that they accumulate by publishing in particular places. But there, I think it begs another question about open access. If you're kind of creating this supposedly flat landscape where there potentially isn't as much curation of knowledge, where potentially the quality of knowledge is decreasing across the board, then maybe those people are also kind of losing out in the prestige economy. So it's problematic in a lot of ways.
Okay, thank you. Richard first, and then.
Okay, hi, thank you. I've got a question about how we move forward from a notion of international being good and not international, and not global being bad, in the sense that QS, for example, talks about, this came up earlier at the beginning, where good universities have international staff and international students, and therefore universities that don't aren't, by kind of, that's what they're suggesting in a way. And also moving on to the idea that good students have international experience and those kinds of things, therefore students that don't aren't. And then also that good people are global citizens and think globally, whereas other people aren't. How do we kind of move on from there, particularly when there are certain people or groups that see these good things supposedly as being threatening or bad or out of touch, in a sense, particularly around populism, if that makes sense?
Thank you very much, Richard. Rosemary, would you like to?
Yeah, there's a lot of different issues buried in there, aren't there? So, I think one of the challenges initially, anyway, is that the league tables often define what is international in terms of where people come from, but they don't define it in terms of the content of what people write about, or more important, what they teach. Because many institutions will boast that they're international, and what that means is they've got lots of international staff and students, whether, of course, in some cases they're going to be able to keep these in a world which increasingly is drawing boundaries around countries rather than opening up, is an interesting question. But unless they've actually internationalised their curriculum and their research as well, and of course in science, yeah, well, of course there are differences, but within science broadly, what you do in one country is similar to another. There may be different rules about who owns the knowledge and who does what with it. But in the arts and social sciences, then actually the knowledge itself is different. So it becomes much more complicated to kind of think about how you do that internationalisation. So I suppose one question is kind of actually thinking about kind of moving beyond that kind of simplistic notion of internationalisation. But your point about international mobility, I mean, I think that is becoming quite a problem, not just in terms of kind of student CVs, but I mean, I was recently involved in an evaluation of kind of postdocs for a kind of big international organisation. And, you know, extra points get given to people who've had international mobility. But there may be some people who, for all sorts of reasons, it might be health, it might be, you know, care of young children or dependent relatives or something, you can't actually be internationally mobile. So now they're even more disadvantaged because they can't get hold of that experience. So I think the question is, how do we still value those things, but also value other things? Are there other ways to get those kinds of experiences? And are there other dimensions that we ought to be looking at? And it seems to me a lot of the debate about internationalisation has not focused very much on that. There is a debate around it, but it's not really having much effect on what universities actually do. And I think that's the worrying bit, is because people know that's out there, but they're trying to ignore it because it's difficult. It's much more difficult to have a debate about what is an international curriculum, what is an inclusive curriculum. I know that the National Union of Students in the UK is trying to have that debate at the moment, and is finding it quite hard to get people engaged. Students engage in it, but often academics don't really want to engage. I think it goes back to your point about different disciplines. You know, academics in social science and arts and humanities think of themselves as individuals rather than that in that kind of more collective frame of mind about what does that mean. So I think there's a lot of challenges there. I think it's very important we look at them, but I don't think it's easy to solve them.
Okay. First we have a question here, and then the last one there.
Hayley Boyce from the British Accreditation Council. My question relates to, I think it's a gentleman from the European University Association. You mentioned the importance of giving access to high quality higher education. In an increasingly globalised world, how do we understand quality? How is that defined, and how is that impacted as we become increasingly more global? I'm just interested in views, really.
Yeah. It's a very hard question, actually. Nobody can answer. Yeah.
But then it's hard for, I mean, who is looking at quality? Is it quality for the stakeholders? Is it for the students? Is it for the universities? Is it for the staff at universities? It's really difficult, and then we've got different measures that could be used as well, and then that's become monetised as these companies are doing these measures.
And you yourself are coming from accreditation institutions, so you have
we're valuing quality, but in a different way than
exactly.
Yeah, I would just say briefly that one thing I would say is just to focus on actually quality as opposed to quantity. So to take quality seriously, to take the sort of intrinsic value of things and people seriously, as opposed to always trying to measure them in the language of numbers, in the language of quantification, or to use maybe Marxist terms in the language of exchange value, and to take use value very seriously. So really to focus on quality itself and not always translate it into some abstract number.
Yeah, Sam?
I mean, I would just say whatever quality is, it would help to see it as a relational thing rather than something that can be isolated. So quality will depend on what's done with a particular group for a particular group. It's not something that can just be isolated as a quality of an institution that can be abstracted from what it does.
Rosemary?
Well, I think also that the kind of, the measures of quality and the purposes are very closely linked. So not only is it relational, but also, the way that people define quality often relates to how they want to use it. And that, of course, is fine up to a point. But then when that purpose is commercialisation, then it becomes more problematic, because the things are often defined in a particular way because it's easy to collect the data, or because they have some kind of device or mechanism or platform platform that will collect that data rather than because it's actually useful. So, for example, often a proxy for teaching quality is things like the staff-student ratio. Now, clearly, if you're talking about tiny children in a primary school, then the number of children in a class is really important. But actually, there isn't a lot of evidence that the size of a group in higher education necessarily affects the quality. It depends what you're trying to do, and it depends how you organise the pedagogies. So I think trying to sort of join up the kind of, the question about what are the mechanisms and what are the purposes, and having some kind of wider debate about that is actually quite important. I mean, there are huge debates about the quality of teaching, as we no doubt know. There's massive literature on it. But there's no great consensus about how we actually decide, for example, what counts as excellent teaching. Because for a start, you have to ask different people, as you said, different audiences would have quite different views. Some people might think that rote learning is a really good idea. Some countries still think that that's a good idea. Lots of students will say, actually, that's a waste of time. So it really does need to kind of think about both ends of that, I think.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to respond as well?
Yeah, just a small word to say that I'm actually connecting both questions. The one on, the intrinsic value of what international and global, and the one on quality, because this is how I understood the question on the goodness of what's global, is actually why would international higher education or international scientific cooperation be more qualitative? Okay, why? And this is something that is very, very important. We can imagine that knowledge can be produced very locally and have tremendous universal implications. We can imagine that a national instructor in a national classroom would give a fantastic global dimension to his teaching. So how do we measure and appreciate this? And I joined the fact also because I had an electoral night in France yesterday night, that to answer this question in the public debate, why more global and more international is good or is not good, I think that this is something very important to tackle in the public debate. Because if not, we are just leaving this idea of a superiority of what is global. And I mean, people are just living every day the drawbacks of globalization as well. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Very good point. And our final question?
Thank you. I'm Helen Murray from University of Sussex. Sam, I think you mentioned in your opening remarks, I think it was, briefly about the different impacts of globalisation of higher education on universities in the global north and universities in the global south. And I was also interested in, Pauline, you reflected on these different meanings of globalisation, one on the one hand being about circulation and blurring of boundaries, but on the other hand being about, in a sense, universalisation and comprehensive meanings of things. And it just made me think about the growing movements around decolonisation of knowledge, particularly driven by student movements at the moment in South Africa, but also in the UK and other places. And that not just being a debate within post-colonial studies anymore, but kind of going beyond into other disciplines. And I was just wondering really about the dynamic, the relationship between that movement around decolonisation of knowledge and globalisation of higher education. Are they kind of in opposition to each other? What's the dynamic between?
And open knowledge added to that as well. Yeah. Would anybody like to respond? Pauline?
Yeah, well, I think this is a very good example of the tension within university as an institution, for instance, because we can say that the way universities spread around the world is a very typical colonialization process. This is colonial, okay, coming from Europe, and so in European countries spread the European state and the European university. Okay, this is one way to see the picture. But there is another way, which would be to say, okay, but also this plasticity of university as an institution gave it the capacity to be a fantastic instrument of political fight against the colonizer. Okay? And so university is both things. This is something that was spread by colonization, but at the same time, this was one of the main instruments to fight against the colonizer, because this is so plastic and so adaptable as an institution.
But is that still the case? I mean, in a way, that was certainly the case in the post-independence era, but I wonder, in this age of globalisation of higher education, is in a way there's been a sort of weakening of that role of the university in the, as a kind of anti-colonising, is that capacity is kind of being weakened in some sense.
But it's also quite, particularly if you look at South Africa's situation, it's quite a complex debate, isn't it? It's not just about decolonisation of knowledge, it's about kind of what happens to black graduates versus white graduates, it's about what happens in terms of the fees and who pays for the system if there are no fees. But also, I guess that part of the challenge is about kind of, it's easier to define what decolonisation of knowledge might look like in some disciplines than others. I have no idea what a decolonised chemistry looks like. I have some idea what, a decolonialised social science might look like, although clearly that's only my view of it. But so I think it's not a question which is easy to answer in relation to different disciplines. So I think sort of opening that up is really important. But it's actually not, again, it's quite hard to kind of see how you actually proceed, because many of the people shouting about it really don't necessarily have answers themselves. They're asking the question, which is important, because of course that's what you do first. You ask the question, then you kind of look for ways to do it. But I suppose there's a kind of comparable debate, and I don't know whether it's more like about decapitalisation. If you look at economics, which is clearly economics with its paradigms, has completely failed to kind of deal with many of the kind of economic problems of the world. And there is a movement to kind of change economics, but it's not having much success. So it's a question about how you get ideas about how to change things, then you have to kind of get collective action behind it for people in those disciplines to actually do it. And that seems to me that's the hard bit. So I think it's an important kind of fight, and it's clearly a struggle that's been going on, as various people said, a long time. But the current sort of way in which it's kind of seen is particularly kind of difficult, I think, to kind of say, well, how do you actually make progress beyond saying we want this? Well, what is it that you want to happen? And then that questions the notion of the university in the first place, I think, because it's still for many people a kind of an access to privilege. Although, of course, if you're kind of studying, in a kind of dark room while your electricity's just been turned off with some kind of, multinational publisher who's kind of selling courses, then your notion of what privilege is completely different to if you're in a kind of leafy institution, sitting in a nice library and, everything you want is on tap because your institution's paid the Elsevier subscription.
Yeah. I will abruptly stop this panel here, but don't worry, we still have the whole afternoon. We've tackled really a lot of issues here, from shifting notions of knowledge production and distribution, global infrastructures, privatization, economic value, enclosures, multiscalar, multilateral actors and governance, inequalities, hegemony, power relations, also contributions of different disciplines, and the need for collective action. So there is plenty on our plate to work with in the afternoon. Thank you very much for the panel and for your active involvement and also for excellent questions. Thank you all.